porque ela tem uma pesquisa em andamento, no campo de pesquisas mais amplo, que são as pesquisas dela. Ela tem uma longa trajetória, uma longa tradição de pesquisas no campo da governança participativa, dos movimentos sociais, das organizações comunitárias e como elas se organizam internamente e como elas se articulam com o setor público, dessa interação entre digamos assim, setor público e organizações da sociedade civil. Então, é um campo de pesquisa que tem muito a ver com pesquisas em andamento no nosso departamento, e ela esteve no Brasil recentemente, fazendo pesquisas de campo. Nosso departamento teve a grata satisfação de acolher a presença dela como nossa professora, nosso colega visitante, como visiting fellow. Esta apresentação que ela fará hoje é sobre o andamento dessa pesquisa, que é uma pesquisa sobre as organizações comunitárias que surgem a partir do programa Minha Casa Minha Vida, e ela fez pesquisa de campo em Salvador, São Paulo e no Rio de Janeiro. A Maureen também é uma brasilianista. Ela tem 2 livros publicados recentemente, no qual o Brasil é objeto de estudo. Um se chama Democratizing Urban Development, Strategies and Outcomes of Community Organizations for Housing Across the US and Brazil. E um outro livro que se chama Civil Society and Participatory Governance, Municipal Councils and Social Housing Programs in Brazil. Então, o campo dos desenvolvimentos, das políticas urbanas e das políticas habitacionais tem sido um objeto sistemático de estudo da Maureen, a partir da qual, com base nos quais ela faz as suas pesquisas sobre a questão das organizações comunitárias. Ela tem uma série de artigos publicados, não vou mencionar aqui para não roubar o tempo de nós escutarmos a apresentação dela, né? Para aqueles interessados tanto em estudos sobre o Brasil, mas principalmente nesses temas da governança participativa, experiências de governança participativa no Brasil, são leitura obrigatória. Maureen, eu não vou estender a minha apresentação, os nossos colegas estão aqui, os nossos alunos estão aqui para escutar os resultados do seu trabalho e da sua pesquisa. Uma enorme satisfação contar com você aqui, e eu passo a palavra para você.
Ok, muito obrigada, Marta, e vou falar em inglês, mas se vocês quiserem perguntar algo em português, por favor, não é problema. Ok, let me share my screen. Okay, so thank you to Marta for really sponsoring me to come to USP as part of my Fulbright grant to Brazil. I was disappointed I didn't get to come in person to meet many people because it was still COVID times in March and into April, but I did get to see Marta, and I very much appreciated all her help in guiding me in this study and in just supporting me to be a visiting fellow at USP. And thank you also to Rogério for inviting me to this seminar today. So the title of my talk is The Impact of Housing Benefits on Perceptions of Government and Political Participation. And there's my email address in case anyone would ever like to contact me. You are more than welcome to. So as Marta just so nicely said in her introduction, I've been studying Brazil for I guess around 15 years, which I feel like makes me sound old, so it couldn't possibly be true, but I guess around 15 years since I started doing my dissertation work in Brazil, and I studied the municipal councils for housing in Sao Paulo and Salvador, Recife, and Curitiba. And then I went on to look at the strategies that community organizations for housing use across cities in the US and Brazil in my second book. And so, my areas of focus have always been on the side of civil society and on social movements, but I was also very interested in how this movement towards participatory governance and participatory projects, what the impact was on people's lives, the people who were receiving the benefits of various projects. And various social policies. So in 2017, I worked on a paper with Matthew Layton, who is at University of Ohio, and Lucio Heno, who I believe is in Brasilia still. And the paper was about what effect Brazil's Bolsa Familia program has had on not just people's lives, in terms of the quality of life, in terms of what the money could do for them, but also how it made them feel about government. Did it make them more trusting in government? Did it provide more legitimacy to the regime? And so the question really is, what is the impact of receiving a social benefit on perceptions of government? And so in that paper, we found that there was increased trust in core state institutions. And I think this was circulated to you. And I circulated it simply because it was a motivating paper, because I have not had a chance yet to write on the new research. But we found that there was increased trust in core state institutions and in local government and the incumbent who people held responsible for the benefit. But there wasn't really a difference in more generalized support for democracy or regime principles. So I took this idea going forward, right? What is the impact of receiving a social benefit on perceptions of government? And I wanted to apply it to housing, which of course, I've studied over the years. So I wanted to know the impact of housing policy on politics, right? So what does it mean when you receive, when you're part of a housing project, or when you receive a benefit from the state in terms of a home? So with Bolsa Familia, we know that recipients there's some differences in opinion, but most of the evidence seems to suggest that Bolsa Familia program recipients are more likely to support Lula, or were more likely to support Lula, than non-recipients. And there's greater trust in local government. So I wanted to know, do housing recipients also remain loyal to those responsible, to those that they hold responsible for the program? Or could it be that instead they become more alienated from the party and the government by their experience? For example, if they had a negative experience, if they felt that they weren't treated right, or the quality of the housing was poor, or the process was just very cumbersome, would they instead feel less inclined to support the party and the government in general? And so also, I wanted to know, what are the other effects on perceptions and participation? And I think these things matter for how we think about policy design, right? Whether we think, perhaps you've heard of the idea of like the social construction of policy design. So, how do we make people feel? How do we stigmatize people by the policies we put in place? What are the policies saying to people? So how does the policy design matter for not just the quality of life, but also for, the long-term, inclusion of people, especially low-income people, the poor, and for the long-term strength of democracy? Okay. So hold on a second. Okay, so hold on, did I miss one? Yeah, okay. So I started this work back in 2019. I started thinking about these questions, following the motivating paper. And I knew I wanted to, start a new research project. And so this is pre-pandemic. I had a little bit of money, so I went to Sao Paulo to kind of do some preliminary field work on these questions. And so because I had studied housing for quite some time in Sao Paulo, I already knew many of the leaders of the União, dos Movimentos de Moradia, in Sao Paulo. And so they helped me to access two different sites of housing projects. One was the Dandara condominium, which was in Minha Casa Minha Vida Entidades project in the center of Sao Paulo. And the other was the favela Vegarino Novo Divinéia in São Mateus. And so I went to both of these very briefly, just in a 2-week kind of trip, did some preliminary interviews, talked to people about how they felt about the 2018 election, who they had voted for. It was very important at that moment. People were still very divided, still are, I suppose, but in 2019. And it was very interesting that I did find that there were many people who had really turned away from the PT, were really disappointed in the PT, even though both of these projects, especially Dandara, was a gift. The building was a gift. Maybe some of you listening know more about this than I do, from the federal administration of Lula. But so some people had turned away, but there was still, I could say, a good solid backing of the PT among people I talked to, but definitely disillusionment, I would say. But I learned in this brief preliminary field work that it was really difficult to reach uninvolved residents to ask them about their political perceptions and their participation. So, I've been really fortunate to have contacts within the movements, but it's really hard to reach those people who don't get involved and who are just perhaps more on the margins of the communities. But I did also see that there really was a gap between the expectations of government and what government should do, and the reality on the ground in terms of the quality of life people were experiencing, the stigma they were still experiencing, and the continued polarization and fear of violence. So particularly in the favela, and the leaders there were very conscientious to use the word favela. They felt, as a sort of taking back the word as a place of pride. But it is, a place that has been impacted pretty significantly by violence. And I understand, especially in the last few years, it's gotten worse. So, I think people expected that housing, having a home was going to be a solution in their lives. And that wasn't always the case, basically. So when I came in 2022, I had a research plan that involved doing qualitative research in 3 cities. So I had, and those 3 cities were, as Marta pointed out, Sao Paulo, Salvador, and Rio de Janeiro. And so in each city, I wanted to do open-ended interview questions with individuals, and in some cases groups. Sometimes people they feel more comfortable talking in groups rather than being sort of on the spot for individual interviews. I did surveys to reach more residents in Sao Paulo because, and I'll show you in a second the projects I did, but there were 5 cases in Sao Paulo. And I couldn't possibly reach enough people in the short amount of time I had. And also I wanted to try to get at people who weren't necessarily going to come to me or come to an invited group of the leaders of the projects. So I did surveys of more residents, and then I also did in-depth interviews with movement leaders in each of the 3 cities. But I did focus the projects that were done in Alto Gestão, so that were mostly part of the Minha Casa Minha Vida entidades. And that was a deliberate strategy on my part because, for one, I felt more comfortable going into these communities. I think in, again, the short time I had, I wanted to be more focused, and I knew it would take a long time to get access to some of the Minha Casa Minha Vida sort of normal projects. And I think, as I'll talk about in a second, we already know a good bit about the Minha Casa Minha Vida projects. So in each city, I used contacts with the União to have a local assistant in each city who could really help me with, making scheduling appointments and meeting people in the communities and just having access that I wouldn't have had on my own. And then I also did participatory observation in some of the community meetings and in the União meetings that went on while I was there. And in the future, my research plan, I haven't exactly decided what to do about this yet, but I'm still thinking of using some comparison to US housing projects, although there isn't anything just like the Minha Casa Minha Vida entidades. There are some forms of participatory housing projects that could be useful comparisons. Okay, so we already know that in traditional housing projects, and some of this has been done recently, Natalia Bueno comes to mind in terms of recent research on Minha Casa Minha Vida and the impact on people's lives. And we know that there has been, many negative outcomes, and Raquel Holnicki, I know, has done some work too. But we know that there are problems with security in terms of non-state violent actors, in terms of gangs or militias taking over, particularly in Rio de Janeiro. There's the problem of peripheralization with projects that are located far from the city center, cheap plots of land, disconnected from quality employment opportunities, poor quality housing. So, projects that were put up rapidly and, just seem to fall apart. Alienation from people saying, particularly who may have been removed from another community. Again, I'm thinking of Rio with people who were removed because of the World Cup and the Olympics, moved to a new project without knowing anyone, or cut off from their home communities, and also the negative view of government. So, people who weren't necessarily happy with what happened in terms of the unit they got. And so I wanted to know, our participatory housing projects here, those done in Alto Gestão, are they different? And so the 3 variables, 3 questions were about the quality of life. So do recipients or people who participated in these projects, what has been the impact on their quality of life in terms of income, in terms of security, in terms of more access to education or stability? 2, what are their perceptions of government? Have they changed over time? Do they have more negative or positive perceptions as a result of their experiences? And so we would think that if people have, a positive interaction, they would have greater satisfaction, and perhaps the project would meet their expectations more. And 3rd, in terms of empowerment or participation, do people tend to engage further in other claims-making activities, right? So do they get involved? Does the one involvement in the housing project then spill over, or motivate them to participate in other forms of politics? So the main questions were, what has been the impact of autogestal projects on the lives of participants? So how have recipients' lives changed as a result? Do housing recipients have increased trust in government? And how does taking part in the project impact political participation? And then, finally, I think what's really important really is, what are the challenges of these types of projects and what is their future, not just for Brazilian cities, but as a model for other cities as well. So first, I think it's important to think of housing as a welfare benefit. And I think people don't always see it that way. But housing is a visual benefit, right? It's a tangible benefit that politicians can point to and say, look, I helped construct this many units. I housed these many families. And it's, as I'm sure many of you know, it's just a very useful tool at election time, right? To point to something visual. But homeownership is, or homeownership is also a lasting asset for the people who live there, right? And in Brazil, what I've always thought is fascinating is that public housing, as we know it in the United States, is owned by the resident, whereas in the United States, public housing is rental housing. So I think this is it's really different, that it is a government welfare benefit that is creating a lasting asset for people in Brazil. That doesn't happen in the United States and in many other countries. And it can be a form of security for people, more so than just, the four walls over their head. Also, housing enables people to spend money on goods other than rent. I guess this maybe should be obvious, right? But it wasn't something I really thought about that much before, which is that if you're not paying rent and, you don't have that monthly bill, you can put a lot more towards, food, quality of food and education and other things. Housing also impacts the whole family, right? So it's not just an individual getting one scholarship to school or job training or something, but it's, it impacts the whole family over time, maybe even in terms of education that leads to generational wealth. And so I think it's interesting to think whether housing is a personal rather than a public good. And I think it can be seen as both. And in Brazil, I know the right to housing is in the Constitution. That's not true in the United States either. And so I think it is seen more as a right and as a public good and a responsibility of the government in Brazil than it is elsewhere. So the case selection I used was, I looked at projects that were in autogestal and Minha Casa Minha Vida entidades, and all of them were associated with the União dos Movimentos da Moradia. And we can discuss that. Probably has its limitations and its benefits, but that was how I was able to access these communities. And I think, part of the analysis can also be in terms of the movement's impact in that way. But in Sao Paulo, I looked at Mauricio Leticia, which is in the center, José Maria Amaral y Florestan Fernandez, which is in the east, Barra do Jacaré in the west, and then two older projects. One was Paulo Freire, which was, I think it was from the mid 2000s, maybe 2010, I have to look that up. And then Jardim Celeste, which was the first project done in Mutirão in the early 1990s under Argentina. And then in Rio de Janeiro, I looked at Grupo Esperança, which was a Minha Casa Minha Vida entidades, and then an older project called Shangri-La that was sort of self-financed, just for kind of comparison. And Salvador, I looked at Mangueiras, which is the only project done in Minha Casa Minha Vida entidades. And sort of for comparison, another project called Costa Azul. So I chose Rio de Janeiro for the issue of the militias. I think that's important to kind of take note in terms of how that impacts people's perceptions, and also in Salvador, just the extreme poverty that exists there, how that figured in. Okay, so some of the findings, preliminary findings, I would say, since I'm still going through everything, but I did find that, the Minha Casa Minha Vida Entidades projects were severely hampered by funding cuts after Dilma was impeached. So a couple of these projects were were approved by Dilma the week before she was impeached. And some of them were earlier, but either way, the funding was basically cut off for these projects after Temer and then Bolsonaro came into office. And so you can imagine that some of these projects were in process, in different stages. And so they've struggled, for years to try to get little bits of money to finish the projects. One of the main institutional problems that people repeated to me all the time was that Minha Casa Minha Vida Entidades, Minha Casa Minha Vida, is a program of the government and not the state. And that was an interesting, as a foreigner, that was an interesting difference pointed out to me, because it would not have occurred to me that a signed contract would not have been fulfilled under a new administration. But that seems to be the case, that a program of the government does not necessarily, even if it's been signed and pre-approved, does not continue. And so, there aren't any housing programs that do continue over time. And I think that's a real problem for continuity in housing policy. Also, a lot of these projects had incredibly long timelines. So for many of them, there were 10 years or more from the project's beginning to the end. And so in these projects, I don't think I included this, but people are required to work every weekend, basically, and holidays, to participate in the construction of the projects. And so when you have 10 years or more going on from the beginning to the end, that is an extremely long time that people are committing to this process. And in those 10 years or more, people's lives change significantly. Children grow up, people get married and divorced and everything. And so it's hard to maintain, the participation of people for that long. Also, another problem was that Minha Casa Minha Vida Entidades treated the housing associations like private sector entities. So the associations had to seek out the plots of land, purchase them, go through the real estate market to make the projects happen. And the Caixa Econômica dealt with them as businesses, right? And they didn't have separate rules and regulations for how these projects would be carried out. Also, there was what I would call persistent precarity of status. So because of the bureaucracy of regularization, the permits needed to occupy, and the lack of infrastructure keep people in, just always needing more, always needing more from the government in terms of creating security in the community. And lastly, just violence and controlled by non-state actors. So it's a continuous threat in many of the communities, though I will say that militias or gangs did not occupy any of these projects. The threat of occupation by others is constant. And that's just an ongoing issue that, is sort of beyond the problem of these housing policies in particular, but, it's something to think about in terms of The benefit, though, that these projects have is that they don't have this kind of influence. Many people said it was because of the organization of the community, of the because they're sort of were able to keep out outsiders. Okay, so just to go through a couple of the questions that I asked in the interviews and the surveys. First, how has your life changed as a result of the project? In Sao Paulo said, and people, this is their slogan, right? The house is an entrance to all other rights. And people, some people really believe that and felt it in their lives. Somebody else in Rio said, we were just surviving before, now we're doing a little better, right? Now we're not paying rent, we're better. Here I can breathe freely. People felt calmer, more tranquil, knowing they had the security. Somebody else said, I can say I built it. And not to pay rent is like taking a deep breath, right? People just felt so much more at ease. And then lastly, very positive. I have all my family in one place, but we are all unemployed. So particularly in Salvador, that was a big problem. The economic reality of people's lives really hadn't changed, even if they had a little more security in terms of their home. So some preliminary findings on the impact on the quality of life. People often said they left places of insecurity, paying rent, but also living in conditions of risk and or living with family in overcrowded conditions, living in sort of violent conditions. People said they were more stable for not paying rent, that they had pride in themselves and their communities. They had built significant social bonds. They felt a sense of tranquility, particularly in Sao Paulo, as opposed to the other cities. There were many gains in education. Some people received scholarships, the children and the adults. And importantly, definitely in terms of women's empowerment, the majority of people who work in these projects are women. And so particularly for single mothers who never thought they would have a home, here they are having this very secure environment. But some projects are in dangerous locations or geographically distant from the center. For example, in Sao Paulo, there's the José Maria Amaral and Florestan Fernandez, which is in Cidade Tiradentes. There were a few mentions of better employment or income, especially in Salvador. There were tensions among those who participated more or less. So there's always going to be some people who don't show up and, work and then benefit from other people's labor. And that's just a huge problem. And then lastly, the behavior of neighbors. So people complaining about others who are involved with drugs or destroying things or connected to violence, et cetera. So, these are not perfect communities. These are the most vulnerable people in many cases to begin with. And so it's difficult to maintain, the sense of community. Okay. Another question was, do you have more or less confidence in government as a result of your participation in the housing project? And it was interesting to me that everyone thought of Lula versus Bolsonaro, in this scenario. People said it seemed to have more to do with the government in charge than the project. So the project did not seem to change their opinion as much as just a change in the regime. So, no, not in Bolsonaro was common across cities. Again, these projects were all connected to the União, which is connected to the PT. And so that's not surprising. We can't advance without the support like we had before was something I heard pretty commonly. This was from Sao Paulo. We needed the government, we needed the administration of Lula, and Lula was the primary, person held responsible, not Dilma, which is also interesting. But people also thought no government fulfills expectations or needs. In Sao Paulo, someone said only popular participation gets anything done. In Rio, someone said, all citizens have the right to housing, education, and security. The problem is we still lack education and security because of the governor and militias. We feel insecure in the streets. The militias fill the holes of the government. And in Salvador, the struggle is always the same with or without the PT. And, a lot of people talked about how people, they and others are worse off now than before the crisis of the pandemic, the crisis of governance, and the economic crisis. So I liked this quote from someone in Rio that the government before we ate meat, now we don't even have an egg. Someone said, I don't know if that's a popular saying or not, but I liked it. Okay, so some preliminary findings on the perceptions of government. One is people reflected on the federal government. So I guess I expected that some people would reflect on the municipal or the state government, and that was very uncommon. People mostly just thought of the executive, Lula or Bolsonaro. And there was definitely a preference, towards Lula. Although there were people in all the communities who did vote for Bolsonaro. And I also heard people say more people liked Bolsonaro 3 years ago. Now they've changed their minds. So who knows where they'll be in this current election. There's no confidence in this government to provide for the people, low-income people. The contact with government, though, is mediated by associations. So residents did not have really any contact with the Caixa, with any other government agents. That all went through the leaders of the housing associations. And so that, I think, maybe doesn't allow for them to develop either negative or positive trust in the government themselves. But many did report broadening their understanding of the world and politics. Okay, so another question was, do you feel more like a citizen of the city? And on this question, there was definitely a resounding yes, right? People said, yes, of course I do. In Sao Paulo, a person said, we know we matter because of the coordination and participation in the movement. So that connection to the movement is very important. In Rio, the person said the impact is very profound. It's not just construction, but independence and confidence that they could do it. In Sao Paulo, another person said the ghetto is where poor people have no hope, but here to have a house is to be a citizen, to have hope that things will get better, and to have pride in our communities. And in Salvador, someone said, yes, because of participation, I feel like I'm contributing to my community. Although interestingly, and I heard this from a couple of people, but not very much, the location of the apartment does not represent the rights of the city. So there's still this sort of backlash idea that, yeah, we're really happy with what we have, but we don't, the periphery of the city is still the outside, and we don't feel like we are given the same rights as everyone else, or not everyone else, but those who live in the city center or wherever. Okay, so some preliminary findings in terms of participation and empowerment. For some, they said a home is the end. They don't want to fight anymore, and that's it. And generally, there is low participation. I asked a question about whether how people participated, and everyone said voting, being mandatory, but or they said they also participate in the housing movement, but there wasn't much else that they were involved with. But most said they felt stronger to fight for other services, especially collectively. So there was a lot of evidence of this from older and the newer communities that people bonded to fight the water bill or fight the electric company or fight for streetlights or something like that. And people did participate in some neighborhood organizations, particularly around schools and security. And I thought what was interesting as these projects have gone on for so long, a lot of the children of the original Mucherantes are often in the movement now themselves too. So they've learned from their parents and been a part of this so long, they're now still fighting for their own unit now. And the persistent precarity of regularization and other services is the reason often for continued engagement. Okay, so why do some participate and others don't? This is a hard question to answer, but I think, in Sao Paulo said some people just do what is easiest for them, like supporting the current government. Also in Sao Paulo, sometimes husbands don't know about their wives' participation. Even if they do, they don't want them to continue. So we have to consider the dynamics of the family. And then in Rio, someone said, our fight is for the right to the city, not just a house with four walls. But some people don't think that way. They're used to having nothing and they're happy with just four walls. So there's also that that feeling of, we've got a little bit, let's not ask for more. Let's not continue further. So some of the benefits and challenges of autogestão, just in terms of benefits, the units are bigger and cheaper than those of the regular Minha Casa Minha Vida program. There is more transparency in accounting to residents, so residents are more involved in the program or in the project, and they're usually given numbers and they know what's happening. There is more of an ability to make decisions on the design of the community, of the units. People seem to gain a lot more self-confidence in the process. And I'm not sure about this. People told me, some numbers about, particularly with the older communities, that people are less likely to sell or rent out their units than other types of projects, but I don't have firm numbers on that yet. That's just sort of a preliminary idea. And then in terms of problems, having to go back to the Caixa for any changes, having to work with bureaucracy, that the families and the circumstances change while waiting. This is a significant investment of time. Not everyone could or would want to be involved in this kind of project. The uneven participation definitely creates tensions. Some people said there's a lack of political formation, like people don't really understand why they have to participate or what the right to the city is, and what the point is of participation. And, there's definitely a loss of confidence in housing movements when problems and delays arise. And finally, people in all the projects still talked about the stereotypes that their neighbors had of them as living off the government, and, being low income, poor people who didn't know how to live in society. So just some conclusions, some questions, some next steps, and I welcome all questions from you all. I think participation matters, but it's long, arduous, and messy. So for participatory policies and projects to have spillover effects on democratic engagement, there must be institutional change from the top. So these types of projects in autogestão, they can't work when they're, going on for more than 10 years and people are fighting for years on end to get a drop of money from the government to continue the projects. And so, the government has to be committed, the state has to be committed to the process, or it's not going to work. But for some, it's an exceptionally worthwhile process, especially for women who, never thought they'd be homeowners and who really gained a sense of self-confidence. And it just, looking pre and post pandemic, the living situation definitely enabled people to weather the crises, the economic and health crises over the past, 5 years. And so that, the stability that the housing provided, I think a few of the projects, people just moved in during the pandemic since then. But many people just talked about, with the inflation and with everything going on, it's just a huge benefit to have a stable living situation. In terms of how policies impact politics, there was, you can see that there were failed expectations, but I think in retrospect, people tend to be more positive about the experience than they probably were at the time. There's definitely a loss of trust amongst many people for the PT and for Lula, But there's also this nostalgia for the person of Lula. You know, I often heard people talking about Lula, and this movement leader would say, no, we have to think about the party, not just the person. But that's how most people think is of Lula. And I'm sure many of you know that too. And so, you know, what is the future for self-managed participatory projects? I think this continued decentering of the state is important, and maybe pivotal to actually the implementation of housing projects. So without removing state responsibility. So the state still has a responsibility to fund and to manage projects, but we also need to put some more of the process in the hands of non-state actors, from my opinion. And then, you know, but I think what's tricky is the support from other urban residents, right? And giving up that control to civil society and housing movement and movements and residents. So that is all. I'll stop there. And then I would be happy to take any questions that people might have.
Muito obrigada, Maureen, por essa densa apresentação, que só foi possível dada a sua longa trajetória de pesquisa no Brasil e em pesquisas urbanas e em movimentos sociais e organizações comunitárias. Digamos assim, nós somos felizes de ter podido receber você nessa estadia mais recente, mas certamente a sua pesquisa de campo se beneficiou de uma longa trajetória de pesquisas no Brasil e em movimentos urbanos. Certamente tem questões relevantes. Eu mesma tenho 2 questões para fazer para você, mas nós temos uma regra dentro do departamento de que os estudantes têm precedência. Esse é um seminário para os estudantes, então os estudantes têm precedência na formulação das questões. Então, as perguntas podem ser feitas por aqui, pelo chat, pode ser feitas pelo microfone. Eu e o Rogério vamos monitorar aqui as questões e se vocês quiserem falar diretamente, se quiserem mandar por escrito, nós vamos tentando coordenar aqui essa nossa vida intelectual remota. A Ana Paula levantou a mão, eu suponho que seja a primeira questão. Rogério, não sei se ela vai fazer por aqui.
Estou tentando transferi-la para cá, para ela poder falar, se ela quiser, mas ela não está aceitando o meu convite para vir. Ana Paula, se você nos acompanha e aceitar o convite para painelista, você consegue usar o microfone. Se não, você pode escrever. Ou se foi engano, você nos avisa, por favor.
Tem mais questões aí, Rogério?
Não, por enquanto não. Estou só esperando a Ana Paula mesmo.
Tá, então assim, enquanto os alunos vão esquentando as baterias, aí eu vou fazer a primeira questão.
Por favor.
Maureen, tem uma literatura sobre federalismo e governança multinível, né, que diz que, sobretudo quando você tem políticas que resultam da colaboração de diferentes níveis de governo, né, que o eleitor ou o beneficiário da política, ele fica confuso, né, porque ele não consegue distinguir quem faz o quê, né, e, na verdade, ele não consegue fazer a atribuição de responsabilidade das políticas que ele está recebendo e das políticas dos quais ele é beneficiário, né? O paper que você produziu sobre o Bolsa Família trata dessa questão, e a sua pesquisa também certamente levantou questões sobre essa questão de quando o eleitor fala de governo, né? De qual governo ele está falando? Ele está falando do governo local, ele está falando do governo estadual, ele está falando do governo federal. Quem é o governo para o beneficiário dessas políticas que têm tanto impacto na vida dos cidadãos?
Yeah, I think, I guess it makes sense that people attributed Minha Casa Minha Vida and Tijajis to the federal government, right? Because it was a federal project, and Minha Casa Minha Vida in general is so, it's associated with Lula, right? But I think it's interesting. There were some older projects like Paulo Freire that was supported by the municipal fund for housing. And in that case, people did talk about how they weren't going to give any of the credit to Kasabi, the mayor that was from the other party, not the PT. And I know Erangina in Sao Paulo is so associated with Alta Gestão or with Mutural from the 1980s, 90s. But yeah, I thought it was fascinating to me that no one knew anyone, no one spoke of anyone in the government besides Lula or Bolsonaro, right? Like those are the two polar opposites. And in Salvador and in Rio, the leaders of the movements, of course, they talk about how, in Rio, we've always had a government, a mayor, a governor to the right. In Sao Paulo, people say, yes, we've had both PT and to the right, but it doesn't matter. They're just more jaded, right? They're just not so sure that the PT is always benefiting them or always has the interest of the people at heart sometimes. But yeah, I think that's really interesting that people don't seem to know that much about their residents, right? Not the leaders of the organizations or of the movements, but residents themselves really don't know, much about their local leaders. That's, I think, I don't know if that's is it because that there just aren't that many municipal government programs and state government programs for housing. In Salvador, I think there aren't many, particularly now, but I think it's a real problem, right? That we're talking about very urban projects that should be very localized and very specific to the communities in which they're in, the neighborhoods and the rhythm of the city, and yet the rules from them are coming from the federal level very often. I know Minha Casa Minha Vida is over, but in general, housing projects are generally from the federal level, and so that doesn't make a lot of sense, I think, for attributing or for ensuring that projects really do meet the needs of people at the local level. I see there are some written questions here. So
yeah, pode deixar que eu leio para você, tá? Tem uma pergunta aqui do Vicente Ferraro, e que ele pergunta, tem uma questão de esclarecimento sobre a sua seleção de casos. Ele não entendeu se você também cobriu projetos que não envolveram autogestão ou se os seus projetos são projetos exclusivamente de autogestão.
Yeah, I did just choose projects in autogestão here because of, well, for instance, I was creating this research design when I wasn't certain what I was going to be able to do because of COVID. If I was going to be able to, stay in Brazil very long, And I just wasn't sure what the situation really was in, excuse me, in a lot of the housing projects. And so I did select just the autogestão. Sorry.
Take your time.
But I think it created a good, a different test than I originally thought, maybe. Originally I thought maybe I would compare autogestão with other projects, but it turns out there is a lot of research we already know about the Minha Casa Minha Vida, and so I'm trying to just use that as to say, these autogestão do have different results, and I'm still learning. I'm still studying the other projects too to kind of know what's different. It's an ongoing process. And is the relation to the federal government
Não, I understand. Eu entendo que essa pergunta do Vicente Ferraro, sobre se você acredita que tem impacto no governo federal ou no governo estadual e municipal, eu acredito que você já respondeu quando respondeu a minha questão, por isso que eu não estava priorizando essa. Mas tem uma outra questão do Sérgio Mendonça. Ele gostaria que você falasse um pouco mais sobre a participação de mulheres no movimento pela moradia. Sabemos que no caso do Bolsa Família, as mulheres são protagonistas, como líderes de família, muitas vezes. Da sua experiência de campo, como você percebe a experiência das mulheres, considerando que os espaços de participação costumam ser muito centrados nos homens? Quais impressões você destacaria sobre a participação de mulheres nesses espaços?
Yeah, that's really good question. So I think traditionally these projects, even going back to Jardim Celeste, I'm sorry, I just realized that I said that was the first project. That was not the first project. It was, oh my goodness, there was one more that was before it. But anyway, I think, now I'm forgetting what it was. It's in the east of the city. Anyway, women have always been at the center of these autogestão or projects in Mutirão. I think in some of the projects, the people working at the sites were 80–90% women, which is surprising, right? We're not used to seeing women hammering nails and, carrying bags of concrete and doing construction work. And I think that's part of what is so empowering to women about these projects, is that they see themselves differently than maybe they did before. And, I feel like I can come off sounding a little bit like overly positive or optimistic about the power, the empowerment that comes with these projects, because they are really difficult. But at the same time, for those who really do drink the Kool-Aid, as we say, or who really put themselves into the project and who really create social bonds with others, it's huge, impact. It's a huge impact on their lives. So there were women who told me about how they left their abusive spouses because they were in this project. They worked with the housing movement and they realized they didn't need to live with this man anymore. And that's an amazing accomplishment. And I think I think we often as political scientists live in a very cynical world, but to think that a public policy that the government is supporting can have a transformational impact on lives of women is huge. And it's not going to happen for every woman who participates, but it can for some. And I think it's important to recognize that the projects are led by women, and give them the credit, I guess, that they deserve. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Eu acho que não tem questões no chat, enquanto eu tenho mais uma questão que é a seguinte: sobre a qual eu gostaria que você elaborasse um pouco mais com base na sua pesquisa, que é, nós sabemos que a União dos Movimentos pela Moradia, eu acho que é esse o nome, né? É uma organização social, digamos assim, bastante estruturada, com regras internas, né? Que tem um controle importante sobre a distribuição de recursos, e como você diz, um recurso muito importante, porque é um ativo que muda completamente a vida das famílias e tal. Então, assim, o que eu gostaria que você elaborasse um pouco é assim, essas crenças e essas percepções que você encontrou na sua pesquisa de campo, você atribuiria mais ao efeito da política, e, portanto, ela seria policy-driven, né? Ou ela seria mais atribuída a processos de socialização política que ocorrem no interior desse grande movimento, que é um movimento muito estruturado, né? Então, como é que fica a questão, digamos assim, eu acho que você tem um argumento que é assim, isso aqui, toda essa experiência tem um impacto na percepção desses beneficiários, né? Isso aqui também já está lá como um argumento teórico no seu paper sobre o Bolsa Família, né? Mas a quem você atribuiria o papel de liderança na mudança dessas percepções, né? Ele é mais driven pela policy ou é mais driven pelo movimento social?
Wow, that's a really great question. I hadn't really thought about it it's enough yet, but I think you're right. Without the formation of the movement, people may not have this broader political understanding or, ideology that they develop over time. If it were simply the federal government giving money to a housing association, not connected to a larger housing movement with its own agenda and rules and norms of autogestão and the right to the city and housing as a right, then I think they wouldn't get the same, perceptions and participation. I think you're absolutely right about that in some ways it is very movement driven. I think what's different about the policy, how do you separate out the policy from the movement? I think is to look at those people who didn't really participate as much with the movement, right? Those who, kind of maybe were the children of the people who were originally involved in the movement, but now live in the housing unit, or, look at, that's why I tried to do the surveys to get people who weren't as involved and friendly with the movement leaders, because it is difficult. And I think I found a little bit less sort of willingness to engage in questions of politics, kind of like, I'll vote, I'll do, I'll probably vote for Lula, but I'm not the type to have the shirt with Lula and be at the rallies and, everything. So I think there still is the recognition that the housing benefit and the process that maybe their parents went through or someone went through has made a difference in their lives for security, for long-term education, but it's not the same political sort of impact. And I need to think more about that, I think, because it is hard to separate out, right? And I think as we think about how the government should be or could be supporting civil society, do we want our government to support a certain ideology or a certain political perspective, I guess, through a movement? That's a really good question, I think. Yeah. Okay.
Ainda temos questões, Rogério? Você.
Tenho uma.
Okay.
Maureen, muito obrigado por sua apresentação. De passagem, você mencionou o tópico do crime e das milícias, uma experiência tanto do Minha Casa Minha Vida, quanto, suponho, dos projetos de autogestão também. Mas eu queria que você, se você pudesse falar um pouco mais da experiência de campo que você teve nessas cidades, se você se deparou com essa situação, e como é que você avalia, enfim, o tamanho que isso pode estar, que isso tem ou pode vir a ter, não é? Junto a esses projetos de habitação popular, que é a presença do crime organizado, das milícias e até de facções criminosas, a gente tem notícia também a esse respeito, né?
Yeah, I think in Rio de Janeiro came up the most, right? That the impact of the militias and the violent criminals. And I've read that I think the criminal elements control 60% of the city, which is huge. But and I, heard this from many people, that why they appreciated the community so much was that they didn't have militias, that they were able to keep out the militia and the gangs. In each community, I did hear that, there were certain elements, and, we just stay away from the people we know are involved in drugs, right? Like, they live over there, we live here. In Salvador, there was one project I mentioned briefly, that Costa Azul, that I visited, where I had to get permission from the drug leaders to be able to go in to their community center, and I wasn't allowed to walk the streets. And that one was not connected to the União. That was, but they did have a Minha Casa Minha Vida Entidades project. And it's, they have a huge problem of, factions in the community and violence between two rival gangs. So I'm not sure I have the answer as to why some communities have kept out violence and others haven't. But it seems to me, and I want to look more into this in terms of the numbers, but it seems to me that many of the projects I looked at don't have the tensions, the takeover anyway, by militias and gangs that some of the other Minha Casa Minha Vida projects do. And, I would think that's because of the social capital involved. And I don't know, it could also be, there could be politics underground that I didn't see, right? That maybe there are deals between, militia leaders and politicians who want to show off the housing projects to keep them out of there. I don't know. That was something unfortunately, as an outsider, it's very hard to really, in a short amount of time anyway, get to understand the inside role of crime, right? No one wants to talk about it until in Salvador, they wouldn't talk about it until I turned off my recorder, and in Rio too. And in Sao Paulo, it didn't come up as often, except in Cidade Tiradentes. And in the first Mutual project, which started in the 1980s, which for whatever reason I'm forgetting the name of, the violence has gotten really bad there, to the extent that both the people I talked with, had been, held up at gunpoint several times. So yeah, it's a really hard issue to get at, but I would say that, in summary, I think that there is some benefit to the creation of community and keeping out violence from these projects. Hopefully. any other questions?
I had a hard time to unmute myself. Temos questões ainda, Rogério? Não estou localizando aqui.
Desculpa, eu estava sem o microfone. Não, aquela mãozinha foi um engano.
Maureen, muito obrigada pela sua brilhante apresentação, por fazer um trabalho tão denso de campo, por ter escolhido estudar movimentos sociais no Brasil. Vamos certamente manter o contato, tem muitos estudantes nessa mesma agenda de pesquisa com você que podem entrar em contato com você para dialogar, né? Mas também as nossas portas aqui estão abertas para a sua agenda de pesquisa como uma brasilianista das questões urbanas e dos movimentos sociais. Então, muito obrigada, excelente seminário, parabéns mais uma vez, e é isso.
Muito obrigada a vocês, e sim, foi um prazer estar aqui, e muito obrigada por tudo.
Bye, bye.
Obrigado, Maureen.
Tchau.
Até a próxima. Tchau, tchau.
Até. Tchau.